Hey guys, just a reminder, my online course is Birth Story Academy, and you can enroll in it at birthstory.com. It's taught by me. You can be in your jammies. It's online. It's pre-recorded, and it has a ton of freebies and downloads. It's everything that you need to prepare for your hospital birth. So hope to see you in Birth Story Academy. I'm going to make this quick because this is a 2-part episode, and we didn't know that going into it. But Kelli and I had so much to talk about that I decided to break it into 2 parts. So this episode is part 1 with Kelli the Labor Nurse on Instagram. And at the beginning of the episode, you'll hear a little bit about how we connected on social media. This is a trigger warning episode. So Kelli has had 5 pregnancies. And in this episode, we talk about her experience as a labor and delivery nurse. We kind of chat. We talk about her first birth 9 years ago. And it was, your typical, she really wasn't, that prepared, let's say, and ended up having a medicated birth with Pitocin and episiotomy and just the different things. Then Kelli goes on to talk about 2 miscarriages and losses in detail. I wanted to record this episode because it's very important that I honor all types of birth, including birth where there is loss and miscarriage, so that you can understand what it's like to miscarry at 6 weeks, what it's like to miscarry at 11 weeks, and to be able to make informed decisions about things like miscarrying at home, utilizing things like site attack, or having a DNC. So this is a trigger warning episode. It is a beautiful episode, but in part 2, we are only talking about her rainbow birth stories with Riley and Clayton. So if this episode feels like it wouldn't be safe for you, you can move along to part 2 and just listen to the birth stories of her rainbow babies. If you are up for that knowledge and learning about what it's like to be kind of unprepared for your first birth, being a labor and delivery nurse, and then getting some education and information around miscarriage, then I would like you to try to listen to this episode. It's very powerful, but they are separated to keep you safe, to keep little ones safe if they're listening with you. And you can just skip right over to part 2 if you just want the rainbow baby birth stories. Okay, let's get to it. What does a contraction feel like? How do I know if I'm in labor? And what does the day of labor look like? Wait, is this normal? Hey, I'm Heidi. My best friends call me Hides. I'm a certified birth doula, host of this podcast, and author of Birth Story, an interactive pregnancy guidebook. I have supported hundreds of women through their labor and deliveries, and I believe every one of them, and you, deserves a microphone and a stage. So here we are. Listen each week to get answers to these tough questions. Birth Story, where we talk about pregnancy, labor, deliveries, where we tell our stories and share our feelings. And of course, chat about our favorite baby products and motherhood. And because I'm passionate about birth outcomes, you will hear from some of the top experts in labor and delivery. Whether you are pregnant, trying desperately to get pregnant, or you just love a good birth story, I hope you will stick around and be part of this Birth Story family. I think we can do this, Kelli. Welcome to the Birth Story podcast. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. You guys, this is Kelli Labor Nurse, and I've been following Kelli on Instagram. I really love following labor and delivery nurses because I learn a lot. Like, even though I've been a doula for 20 years, I'm a forever student. And because I didn't do anything medical, I really like seeing like the balance of like what our labor and delivery nurses are doing and what their perspective is in teaching and in birth. And so I found myself constantly just like liking Kelli's posts. And then eventually we connected because I reached out when she was posting her birth stories. And I was like, so we should record these on the podcast. Kelli, tell us what we're going to talk about today.
We're going to talk about some birth stories. Each birth story is completely different. And I think it helps me be a better nurse because I've been experienced with induction. I've been experienced with unmedicated. I had a postpartum hemorrhage. So I feel like it makes me a better nurse, but it just, I think it also resonates with people who've been pregnant. So,
Yeah. Why are you a labor and delivery nurse?
so I've actually wanted to be a labor and delivery nurse since I was 16 years old. I want to be that nurse. I want to be that nurse to really just like make a difference in those people's births. And I think I could truly do this. Yes.
Okay, but question, but like why like at 16, what happened? Like you were like, "Oh, I knew since 16." Did you watch like The Business
Yeah.
of Being Born? Like what
I
happened at
don't
16?
I don't know. I don't know. It was the weirdest thing. I was a product of the 80s. It was inductions. It was all these things. It was formula feeding. And just one day at 16, I'm like, I want to be a labor delivery nurse. I'm going to breastfeed. I want to have this kind of birth, and completely polar opposite of anything I've ever been around. And like I said, I don't know what hit. I don't know. It just, the bug hit at 16 and it never left. And
Yeah. I think a lot
anything's
of our
possible.
jobs are like callings, right? Like
Yeah.
the bug hit me at 12 and I didn't have language for it at the time. Like I didn't know what a doula
Mm-hmm.
was, you know. I was serving as a doula at 12 years old when my mom miscarried actually on the floor of our bathroom, one of my
Oh,
siblings.
man.
And that's when it was planted and it was like birth work from there on out. And you just never know, you guys, when you're like life calling is just going to hit.
Yeah,
And
it really does. And it's so crazy. Like, it truly was meant to be.
it is amazing. And what we do in birth work and what we see is like, it's mind blowing. So,
Yes.
Kelli, before we get into your 5 pregnancies, 2 losses. So, trigger warning,
Mhm.
everyone. We're going to talk about 2 losses and we're going to talk about strategies for a missed miscarriage because we just don't
Mhm.
do enough talking. And I really try on this podcast to cover miscarriage and cover what it's going to be like and to cover strategies to help other people who may have miscarried that are listening to the podcast. So, we're going to talk about your 3 live births. We're going to talk about your 2 miscarriages. But before we dig in, I'm going to curveball you right now. Can you tell me like your most memorable birth story as a labor and delivery nurse?
Oh, man, so many. It was witnessing my first unmedicated birth because at the teaching hospital, you really don't see that often.
Yeah.
And it was this first time mom, and we just really, really connected. You get to that point in transition where, and I tell a lot of my moms, and I don't tell them to, I don't say this to scare them. I say this to, one thing we've been taught in nursing school, if you can anticipate something, you're going to cope better.
Mm-hmm.
And, I always tell people when you get to transition, that's when you get to the point you don't want to do it anymore. When you get to the point where you say, I quit, I panic, this was dumb. And she was just getting to that point. She'd been up all night. She was tired. And we were like slow dancing, because the husband was tired and he was getting
Yeah.
overwhelmed. And I was like, just one contraction at a time, just one contraction at a time. And the OB was sitting in the room because we just knew any minute she was going to have this baby. And she was just getting so, so tired. And I was like, and I said, just, you can do anything for one contraction. Just give it maybe one more. And she ended up delivering it. Like I said, it was my first unmedicated delivery. And her and I were like, "Oh, you did it. I'm so proud of you." Like, and she was so happy and she was crying and she was just like, "Thank you." And I was like, "You were awesome." And it was just so cool because this person pushed how they wanted to push. Nobody was telling them how. And it was just such a different experience. And that was kind of one of those things I was like, wow, I was just in awe by how amazing that was.
Yeah.
So
Ah.
that's probably one of my most memorable ones just because it was one of my first unmedicated deliveries. And like I said, that is hard in a teaching hospital.
Um, what is something that you would change? Like if you could like walk on to every labor and delivery unit and just like
Oh
change
man,
it.
autonomy,
Okay.
autonomy, autonomy, autonomy. That is something that drives me insane. Like, give patients more time. It doesn't have to be rushed. If a patient says they want something or do not want something, that's a given. That needs to be respected. And that, I feel like, as a nurse, is one of the stressors that I deal with, is just knowing that this may not go how they want it to go. And that's so upsetting because, again, a patient always has a choice. They always have the right to refuse. We need to be respectful of that. And if I could change one thing, it would be doing that.
Yeah.
So
Agree. And I would go on
yeah.
to say that autonomy is one of the higher things when we study evidence-based care and birth outcomes. And those that have not only good birth outcomes, but report feeling good about their birth were shown and given body autonomy.
Yes, I feel like we see a lot of trauma lately, or just see it in the birth world in general, due to the lack of autonomy and due to the rush. I have worked in places where we start this induction and hopefully you deliver very quickly, and then I've worked in a place where the inductions took 2 to 3 days, and that to me is just, that was wonderful. And even then I felt like the birth outcome, that the parents felt better. And it was very much of, I don't want to do this just yet, let's try this. And the provider was like, okay. And I'm thinking, yes, why can't every place do that?
I know. Your story with your 9-year-old in Kansas, my story with my 9-year-old in Charlotte, North Carolina, like, they're very similar, and they're very similar to a lot of listeners. So a lot of listeners come to the Birth Story podcast because they walked into the system on their first birth and they were like,
Yes.
I don't need to take a birth class. And maybe I read this book, or maybe I did 1 or 2 things. But for the most part, they really just went on about life in pure bliss and ignorance about what the transformative experience of pregnancy, labor, birth, postpartum can be. And like anything, right? If I go try to run a marathon right now and I can't run a mile, like, that's probably not going to work out so well for me. Right? I'm probably going to be like, I may be simultaneously proud that I did it, that I crossed the finish line, but like also traumatized by like how horrendously hard that was, right? Versus like maybe training a little bit and it could be like a little bit easier. So let's kick off your birth story with Reed, your 9-year-old.
Yeah.
And at the time you were not a labor and delivery nurse, correct? Right? At the time you were.
Correct. I was actually a hairstylist.
Oh, and you have great hair, by the way. I'm like, I am checking out Kelly's hair right now, and it is like really good, you guys. Like thick, full, long, like a little reddish. Yeah. Like, beautiful. So you were a hairstylist, and you get pregnant. And so tell me a little bit about your pregnancy, and then like, did you get induced, or how did you know you were in labor? Like, what did that look like going into that first birth?
Yeah. So I got pregnant after, started trying in May, and then I think I found out on our anniversary that I was pregnant in November. And kind of a cool note that'll tie into all my kids is I found out November 11th. So number 11 is a little special.
Okay.
And I was 11 days post-ovulation, but I found out I was pregnant. I had nausea for 2 weeks, and then it was seriously the easiest pregnancy ever. I'm one of those people that enjoy being pregnant. I was pregnant all summer, and, I really wanted that natural birth. Don't ask me why. That's just what I wanted. And again, my whole family thought I was crazy because they birthed in the 80s where they did all, inductions for vacations. But that's what I wanted. And we took just a basic class. Didn't teach a whole lot. It was just your basic birthing class, nothing too into the woods or anything. And
You
I
mean it
think around
wasn't like how to
30,
birth with a dolphin in the ocean?
yeah, exactly. And then I got to about 37 weeks, I think. Yeah, it was 37 weeks. And my OB, this was in a small rural hospital, was like, well, you ready to be induced? And I said, no, I want to go natural. And again, first time mom, everyone's calling, is it baby time yet? Is it baby time yet? And I'm like, no. So I think at 38 weeks, I opted for a membrane sweep. And I actually remember crying in my car afterward because I was like, I'm feeling so rushed. I didn't want to do that. And membrane sweep did not work. I lost my mucus plug. I had some god awful, like Braxton Hicks, and then nothing. Surprise. And then at 39 weeks, I was like, okay, I'll do, I just felt so pressured into it. I felt pressured from my family. I felt pressured from my OB. And he's like, and he like painted this perfect picture. He was like, you're going to come in Wednesday night. We're going to do a little bit of Cervidil the next morning, have a good breakfast. You can shower if you want, and then we'll just break your water and see what happens. And I was like, oh, wow, this is going to be great. And that is not how it happened at all. I went in the next week.
It's
I
like
was 39 weeks, 6
cringeworthy.
days. Yes. And I had only had lunch. I wasn't hungry. They brought me this nasty food tray. And I'm not saying that's weird. Like it was really, I was like, what is this? So I didn't eat it. And I politely declined. I was like, oh, no, I'm good. I'm still full from lunch.
Yeah.
I'm going to have breakfast. And we started Cervidil. And it was so funny because I've worked out throughout all my pregnancies, like literally like with my last one, the day before I was doing squats at the gym. And so it was so funny. Maybe an hour after starting Cervidil, I was like, oh man, my back, it's feeling weird. And I thought, oh, I just worked out too hard. And then I took some Benadryl because I was having really bad sinus issues. And so the Benadryl's kicking in, but my back's hurting worse. And I had this awful, awful, awful back labor. My water ends up breaking on its own at 4 a.m.
With
So they take the
Cervidil and
Cervidil.
I was going to say with Cervidil in place.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So of course they take the Cervidil out.
But Kelli, let's pause right there. Because we didn't just explain what Cervidil is. So could you just, so that people understand why we would need to take it out when your water broke too?
Yeah. So it's a cervical ripening agent. It basically, there's these things called prostaglandins that can help with the cervix. So say your cervix isn't right, I guess, it is shown people tend to hopefully do better if they're more dilated, if they're more effaced and thinned out. Cervidil helps with that. I guarantee you I was probably luckily to be dilated to a 1 when they started it. So that just helps soften, helps efface, helps get you ready for birth. And some people go into labor right away. If your water breaks, there is what they call that risk of infection. So that's why they pull it out. So that's what they ended up doing. And these contractions all of a sudden just came back to back to back. And pun intended, they were in my back. And I was not prepared to cope with back labor. I didn't even know what that was. Here I was so informed by my one birth class that I took, and I just was not prepared for it at all. Next thing you know, my whole family shows up to this induction.
Stop it. No.
Yes.
That
and
is
as
not
a labor
helpful.
nurse now, the more people in the room, I'm like, oh, geez. And so here I am. I'm exhausted. I had been up all night. I was starving. I was having contractions I was not getting a break. I mean, I probably was truly tachysystole, which means way too many contractions. And they're in my face like, oh, you're okay. You're okay. And I love my nurse, and she knew I didn't want the epidural, but literally she got to the point where I felt like she really talked me into it because I didn't want Pitocin or anything. And so she's like, are you sure you don't want the epidural? I know you don't want the epidural, and she just kept going on and on. And she's like, look, this anesthesiologist is getting ready to be in surgery, and I know you don't want the epidural, but if you don't get it now, it's, you may not get it for several hours. And just kept planting that seed. And I kept asking where my OB was because I kept being told this person was going to come in and check, and he never did. And so finally I was like, okay, I want the epidural. And we did the epidural, and OB came in an hour after I was very, very comfortable. And that's when he broke a 4-bag. And I vaguely remember hearing, okay, start Pitocin.
Yep. So
So
you
we started
guys,
Pitocin.
let's define 4-bag. And I'm going to let you do all the definitions, Kelly, since you're labor and delivery nurse, which means you're more educated than I am. So will you describe 4-bag?
Yeah. So there's kind of two theories behind the 4-bag. The first theory is it's kind of, and of course, I'm not going to have my definitions right because it's early in the morning, but it's like you have like the 2 layers of the amniotic sac. So some people believe like one sac tears open and leaks out. And then there's the other theory, which I kind of agree with. The other theory is, say baby is super high and there's a spot in your 4-bag in your waters that breaks, and then they move and the sac moves or their head comes down and it kind of plugs that hole. So your water breaks, fluid comes out, whether it's a trickle or a gush, but it doesn't fully, I guess, break as you would think. And so sometimes there's what's called a 4-bag. So as baby moves, you may feel head when you do a cervical check, or you may all of a sudden an hour later feel a bag of waters. And so then that's where they would probably recommend either breaking the water, say in a hospital setting, or eventually it could break on its own.
Yeah. And as a placenta encapsulator, and I take the placentas home and I study them, I do often see the 2 tears. So I'll see.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah. So I'll see the high tear, and then I'll see the actual hole where they did maybe a ROM, artificial rupture of the membrane, with a 4-bag, like closer to the bottom of the sac too. So I can actually see where it popped versus where we artificially ruptured it. And I'll have 2 little holes like in the amniotic sac. So thank you for describing that for the audience. So they came in and were like, hey, we should pop this 4-bag to help you progress.
And so, they broke the 4-bag. They started Pitocin. I think I was complete. So 10 centimeters dilated. So I went from a 3, because I was stuck at a 3, to 10 centimeters dilated around 1. And they had me labor down to probably 4:30. And they had me start pushing. It was so hard to push. I literally could not feel a thing. My legs were so numb. I could not feel anything. And so when they had me push, I guess I was, I literally could not feel, I had no pressure. I had no nothing. And, I ended up, baby had been crowning for a little bit. And by little bit, I mean, I pushed for a total of 20 minutes as a first time pusher who could not feel a thing. So I would say I was doing just fine.
Yeah.
And I had said in the beginning, I didn't want to have an episiotomy, which is where they actually cut the perineum. They don't really do that anymore, but small town hospital. And
9 years ago.
Yes, 9 years ago. Yes. And it's changed so much in 9 years. It's just kind of crazy. And I was given the whole, I just don't know if he's going to come through, this muscle, the skin's holding everything up. I'm just going to do a little cut. And so I ended up with a 2nd-degree tear. And
hey, you know what? That's actually like not that bad for an episiotomy. I'm shocked that it was only
and
2nd
he was
degree.
8 pounds 9 ounces too.
Wow.
So.
Okay, I'm shocked that you didn't. Like, I've only seen. I was going through my head earlier, Kelly, when we were talking about it. I've seen 3 episiotomies in 20 years as a doula. Just not very. It's just very rarely done, and it's usually, the 3 that I've seen. Let's say were, I would say, necessary to facilitate a vaginal birth, right?
Yes.
But it
And
sounds
since
like in
being in the
your
teaching hospital, I only ever saw 2 after that. So very
yeah,
rare.
very rare. So it's hard to know. Like maybe, do you know if there was like a deceleration, if there was an urgency for delivery, if the shoulder was held up, or do you feel like it was just routine?
I definitely feel like it was routine because he was born right at 5 o'clock, and he was very, it's hard to
Sorry.
really remember what happened 9 years ago. And as a first time mom, you don't really know what's going on in the room. But I don't ever remember there being a sense of urgency.
Yeah. Oh, time for dinner, 5 o'clock. Miss
Yeah,
traffic.
I want to go home.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, so he was born, and I was so happy to be a mom. And like I said, he is 9 years old. But I still remember after that being like, man, I really wanted that. I never dwelled on it. I never had any like postpartum with him. But I just remember thinking, if and when we do this again, I definitely want to try harder next time. I definitely want to try some different things and see what could change.
Well, and as a labor and delivery nurse, like there are labor and delivery nurses that will push an epidural because frankly, it makes their job in some ways easier, right?
Oh,
Like to
absolutely.
monitor you from outside of the room and
Mm-hmm.
only really have to come in to flip your side or if they're to adjust a monitor. I mean, it's just if you are a labor and delivery nurse, with all of the respect, you know, your shift is going to be different if your patient is
Yes.
unmedicated versus medicated versus a
Oh,
scheduled
yes.
cesarean section. It's just a different day at work, right? Same
And
same as a doula, right?
yeah,
Um, my job is infinitely harder with an epidural, infinitely
yes.
easier with unmedicated. And what I've heard from the labor and delivery nurses is it's sort of the opposite. Like the unmedicated is harder as a nurse and
Mm-hmm.
easier. Would you agree with that, or what do you think?
Yes and no. I think yes and no. Like I am very pro unmedicated. I love unmedicated. And for me, I don't know. I just love it because I'm very pro. I'll come in, I'll do my thing, and then bye. I'll leave you guys to do your thing.
Mhm.
And then if things start getting amped up and the birther needs me, then absolutely I am there. I'll be your mom, I'll be your doula. Whatever you need me to do, I will be there. And it's just to a degree, depending on who the provider could be in the situation, to me, it is a little easier because terrible it sounds, there's less charting. There's a lot less charting to do and
Oh, that's a
um
good point. Yeah.
more hands on. But at the same time, there are some times where, yeah, if they I don't want people to get upset with me for saying this, but there are some times like if that person has the epidural, it's they relax and then we can do some position changes and hopefully have baby born in a decent amount of time. And I say decent amount of time, not for my sake of convenience, but I will say if they're unmedicated, depending where you deliver, if they're not making that change fast enough, then that's where it becomes hard because then it's like you're racing against the clock. And
Yeah.
that's where sometimes if they have the epidural and we can hurry up and do some of those position changes, then that hopefully can decrease that intervention.
Because it
I don't know if that
relaxes
makes a lot of
yeah,
sense.
because it relaxes the pelvic floor. So I see
Yeah.
epidurals go both ways. Like the natural ebb and flow of physiological birth is that it goes
Hmm.
really hard and fast and then it slows down and and
Yes.
it spaces out. And everybody's like labor stalls. And I'm like, nope, it didn't stall. This
I
is
know. I'm like, it's
normal.
not a stall. Maybe the body needs a break, or
The-
maybe baby's finally turned. And so now your body's going to go, whew, that was hard. Okay, let me take a breather. Now I'm going to start up again. So
yeah. Where we,
I always loved the natural side. For me, I always liked it more, but
yeah.
and thought it was a little easier, but it depends.
Yeah, it depends. I mean, what I think I enjoy the most as a birth worker is when their vision comes to fruition. And
Yes.
like, so if they wanted an unmedicated physiological vaginal birth and that is achieved, that is my best
Mhm.
day at work, right? The harder
Mhm.
days at work are when there's a change of plans and just like
Mhm.
having to help someone emotionally let go, like you had to,
Yes.
Kelly. Like, but it sounds like your nurse wasn't really there to emotionally help you change course, but to say like, well, I was planning for this and I really wanted this, but
Mhm.
now here I am with back labor. Now here I am,
Yeah.
I'm going to say air quote stuck, but like stuck at 3 centimeters. And instead of your nurse like encouraging you, like, do you want to keep going? Or, hey, Kelly, here are the reasons why an epidural could help you still achieve your goal of a vaginal birth, just
Yes.
could be
And sometimes I
presented.
do feel like I know some people want to go without, and I just, as many deliveries as I've done, some people do benefit from the epidural.
Yeah.
You've been up all night long, completely freaking exhausted. Sometimes a little bit of sleep is a beautiful thing,
Mhm.
or you're so tense you don't even realize how tense you are. And just a little bit of that epidural can relax. And,
Yep.
I've seen it go both ways. And I always remind my parents, I'm like, you did not fail because your birth plan changed. Your
Exactly.
feelings are valid. I understand you're upset, and you know, that is your feelings. That is okay. And I'll never say the healthy baby, healthy mom thing because I know that really kind of downplays. But I do tell them, I'm like, it's your feelings are totally valid, but you never failed. You did not fail, and I don't ever
No.
want you to feel like you failed.
Yeah. I'm like, you gave forth life, like
Yes.
a giver of life, no matter what that looks like, is
Yeah.
is magical. It's amazing. It's a miracle. It's all of the things. I have seen it both ways also many times over. I have
Yes.
actually made the recommendations for epidural, nitrous oxide, Stadol, all of the things.
Oh
When
yeah.
my clients were looking to have an unmedicated birth, home birth transfer to epidural. Like
Hmm.
that's the hardest one as a doula, where I'm like, okay, I do feel like you would benefit from a nice long nap and pelvic floor rest because
Yeah.
for whatever reason, maybe baby's position, maybe length of labor, maybe, right? Things
Hmm.
are so hard and so exhaustive that we're pulling up and we're holding our pelvic floor instead of
Yes.
fully in full surrender. And some people, you guys, some of you just do that easily. Some of you are like I don't know, yogis, meditators, runners. Um, you you don't have anxiety in your body. Like it's like something
Hmm.
your brain just didn't give you that. Like it gave most of us anxiety, and you're just like, yeah. I mean, I've labored with so many people that are just like, no big NBD, like birth is no big deal. And then some people, including myself, it's like, oh, it's a real big deal, you know.
Yeah.
It's hard to stay in a place of surrender and relaxation for 24 hours. It's just hard,
Oh,
for the first
totally.
timers. So Kelly, we're aligned. Our 9-year-olds, we birthed them that way, right? We birthed them
Yes.
in inductions with medication and they're fine. That's
Yes.
also something I want to tell everyone, right?
Yes.
Like they're fine, you know. They have
Hmm.
great lives. I don't know. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like,
And like I said, he's great. He's seriously one of the most empathetic human beings I've ever met. For a 9-year-old to have the empathy and the selflessness that I'm just like, wow, you are 9 years old and that kid is he's just gonna really do some things. I truly believe it. Like again, just the way he thinks, I'm like, dude, you think way too, like you are 9 and you're already thinking this kind of stuff.
I
So
know.
yes, they turn out fine.
Yes. And that is something I want to encourage pregnant people to think about, even if you have a change of plans. Even if you
Hmm.
were the biggest change of plan, I always say, is the person who's going to give birth at home and then
Hmm.
ends up in a hospital transfer and then ends up in the operating room. That's like as far away from your plan. All I can assure you, though, is that everything is temporary. You will be okay. Your baby will
Mm-hmm.
be okay. And parenting is so cool. Like the
Yes.
evolution of that first moment of holding them on your chest. And now here Kelly and I are with 9-year-olds. Like, and it's a whole different ball game of what we're talking
Mm-hmm.
about, right? Like friends and emotions and schools and empathy and sports and like I don't know, just
They grow up
mantra.
fast.
They
They really,
do.
it's such a cliche saying, but they grow up so fast.
So fast. And every stage is different and hard in its own
Mhm.
way, right? Like I don't think any stage of parenting is easier than another stage, right? Like it's all fascinating, it's all fun, it's all hard,
Yes.
it's all lovely. But let's just leave it at listen, if you have a change of plans and you get an epidural or an induction like Kelly and I did, like you're good. It's good.
It's all good.
It's all good.
It's all good.
So now you guys trigger warning. We're going to go into 2 loss stories before we go into 2
Mhm.
more birth stories. So a year later, Kelly, you find out you are pregnant again, and it's a surprise. You were not planning that pregnancy.
Yes. It was a very, like, I had just started back to school. That's when the nurse, after I had my son, I was like, no excuses. You can do this. You can be a nurse. Like, you've got this. And so when he was 6 months old, I enrolled to school. I was going back to school, working full time, and he had just turned a year old. And I was just feeling really weird and really sad one day for no reason at all. And I had this weird feeling to take a pregnancy test at 2 in the morning. And I took it, and sure enough, it was positive. And I was like, holy crap. I was not I was not planning this. And it took several months to get pregnant with our firstborn. So again, I was just very, very shocked, very surprised. Just, I remember the day it happened, but at the same time, like we were very careful and trying to be preventative. So again, I was like, how did that happen? Um, so I got pregnant, but I just kept feeling like something wasn't right. And I know they say not to do this because it doesn't guarantee anything, but I've also taken enough pregnancy tests out of 5 pregnancies to know that I'm like, no, there's something to it. I'm one of those people, I pee on multiple sticks. I have to see that double line get darker and darker. And it was just weird to me. Like I just had this bad feeling, and that line just wasn't getting darker. And so I was having a lot of anxiety. And, my husband and I just started sitting down saying we wanted to go with a different doctor. We kind of talked about the birth plan. We were accepting the fact that, well, we were not planning on another baby right now, and it's going to be hard going back to school, but it's going to work out. It's going to work out. And I woke up with my kiddo. It was like 2, 3 in the morning, right before 6 weeks, and again, I was just feeling very anxious. In fact, I was so anxious, I contacted like a pregnancy resource center about getting an early sonogram because I hadn't gotten into a new OB yet, and they had said, around 6 weeks is the earliest I could get a sonogram to see a heartbeat. And so I was like, okay, and I was literally like counting down the days. So I was one day shy of 6 weeks, and I woke up, went to the bathroom, and there was blood. And I was like, oh no. And a couple hours later, it was like 6 in the morning. There was more bleeding. I took pregnancy tests, and that positive line was so faint. And I remember telling my husband, I was like, I'm bleeding. And, I had a cry. He hugged me. But I was very like, you got to get to school. So here I am going to school. I'm bleeding. At this point, I don't have an OB because the OB I had originally with my son wasn't even practicing in that town anymore. So I'm literally calling around trying to get in somewhere. Nobody's going to get me in because I'm a new patient and I'm not far enough along. And, this is my first miscarriage. Like, I don't know what's going on. The
How
bleeding's picking
much?
up.
I was going to say, can you describe the bleeding? Because
Yeah.
I have a lot of clients that bleed throughout their pregnancy. but the
Yes, that's
volume of blood and the type of blood is so different. So could you describe
yes.
miscarriage bleeding?
Yeah. So it did start off a little brown, but it became bright red very fast. And bright red bleeding is usually more concerning. And it wasn't crazy heavy yet. It was probably between a medium and a light period with little clots, like tiny, maybe a dime size or smaller, little clots. And I wasn't feeling any pain yet. There was no pain, no cramping. Finally, I called this OB's office so this particular doctor used to be in the same office as my other OB.
Okay.
And so because they had my prenatal records with my first birth, they were like, we can see you today for some blood work. We can get the blood work ran and we can figure out what your HCG is, depending on what your HCG looks like on the blood work. We could get a sonogram. We could figure this out today. So
Okay.
I'm crying. I'm on my way to the hospital and I call my mom, who at the time worked at that hospital. And I was like, hey, mom, I'm pregnant. I think I'm losing the baby. I'm on my way to the hospital right now for blood work. Please come down there and be with me. And my mom's like, what? Because we hadn't told anybody.
Yeah.
And so she meets me down. I get the blood work. And then, of course, I have to do the dreaded wait. Lab was behind. Then the OB's office was at lunch. And so around 1 o'clock, I start cramping. And by cramping, it did feel like mild contractions. It wrapped around from my back to stomach. I started passing larger clots, probably about the size of like a $50 or more, and just a lot more heavy bleeding. And probably about 15 minutes later, it's when the doctor's nurse calls me and was like, hey, your HCG is a 10. So either you're early in your pregnancy or you lost it. And I said, look, I've been pregnant for, a little over almost 2 weeks now. I know it's a miscarriage. And so that was really hard. That was really hard. And my husband ended up coming home to be with me, and my parents stopped by. And even though it was not a planned pregnancy, it was very hard. And it was just a terrible time, honestly. Like, trigger warning, my grandfather had just committed suicide. Our dog died, seized out on the bedroom floor. My firstborn was super sick, and then we had a miscarriage, and it was just so much. And so it was kind of a dark time. There was definitely some depression, and it was my first miscarriage. And I think what made it so sucky and so lonely was, it's like people were there the first week, and then after that it was like, well, get over it. Or, people mean well, but they really say the crappiest things. Like, they say God has a plan, or something was just really wrong with the baby. And it's like, those just really aren't the best things to tell anybody.
Yeah.
So
How
that was
about
that one.
I'm here to hold space for you, and whenever you need me, I'm here, right?
Yeah.
Like, it can be as
Yeah.
simple as that, you guys.
Yes. And,
Drop off a
allow the
meal.
person time to grieve, because I tell all my people who have losses, I'm like, you're going to have good days. You're going to have bad days. And there's no in between, you're going to be sad. You're going to laugh. You're going to be angry, and it's okay to feel those things.
Yeah.
So,
How long did you bleed
yeah,
for?
really 4 days, maybe. Like, it was basically a light period / spotting after the initial, once things passed.
Okay, so it started kind of brown, it got bright red, it
Mm-hmm.
got heavier, and then within about 12 to 24 hours, right, you were cramping, like where it was wrapping all the way
Um,
around.
yeah. So, like, the spotting was at like 2 in the morning, and then by 1:15 to 2:30 was the heavy bleeding, and then after that it was no more pain. The pain was
Okay.
gone. And then it was just light bleeding afterwards. So that was, to me, probably just passing
Okay.
the
Now,
parts of pregnancy.
how do they make sure everything's gone? Do they later do a sonogram? Like, do they check to make sure that you've passed all the
Hmm.
tissue, or do you just take blood work? How do you
Yeah.
conclude? Like, how does one conclude their pregnancy?
Uh, I think so. Every doctor I do feel is different. This particular physician, they just did, since I did have the heavy bleeding and things seemed like they were passing on their own, and I wasn't soaking, like I wasn't heavy bleeding to where I was soaking through multiple well, actually I was, now that I think about it. But anyway, since things slowed down, they just did another set of blood work to make sure my pregnancy levels were dropping, and they did. They did very, very quickly. And so, um, that was kind of that one. And then I did follow up with my physician at the time 6 weeks later.
Okay. And repeated blood work.
So I don't think we repeated at 6 weeks. I know we did maybe a week after my first initial set of blood work. And then since it was confirmed my levels did drop, then we didn't. I think it was just, we followed up, we, talked about the miscarriage, and then it was kind of like, okay, well, you can resume pregnant sex now, things like that.
Okay. When did your period return?
Maybe 6 weeks later.
Okay. So
If I remember right.
pretty quickly afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It was a little irregular for 2 cycles, and then it went right back into being regular, which, side note, I never had regular periods until after I had my son. So that was kind of different.
Same. Wonder what that is.
Yeah.
I think your hormones just
I know,
figure
it's
it
like it
out.
fixed everything, and then boom. So
Yeah. I tried to get pregnant, Kelly, for 10 months. Yeah. 10 months on, now I'm trying to think of what drugs I took because it was like 10 and a half years ago or whatever. Maybe like Clomid and progesterone or
yeah.
whatever to ovulate, because I just had a weird
Mhm.
cycle and was just not. So anyway, 10 months later, I finally get pregnant. And then I got pregnant 5 months after I gave birth
Oh my God.
because I just had lived my entire life like, well, I don't really ovulate and I have to take these pills to ovulate, and 5 months later, I was like, oh, and I have 2 children, Max and Jagger, that are 15 months apart. So it's so
Oh
interesting
man.
how your body, even after like for me, that felt like a very long fertility journey, even though I know that's a short fertility journey for most people, 10 months. But then to just spontaneously get pregnant without even really trying. I think our bodies are just like more tapped in, more tuned in after we have pregnancies. So what I do know is that after we give birth and after we miscarry, we are become hyper fertile and we drop eggs like crazy. So there's a lot of
Yeah.
multiples and things like that. When did you get pregnant again after that
So I
miscarriage?
didn't get pregnant again until January of 2018.
Okay, because you weren't trying, right?
Yeah, like we had talked about trying, but I don't know. It was just a very weird time, to be honest. It was a very weird time.
Well, you were in
And so
school. You had a lot of
I was in,
trauma.
yes, and I actually had, okay, so I had some crazy issues with my hormones. So literally a month before I started nursing school, I came down with shingles on the right side of my face.
Okay.
And long story short, I ended up getting a steroid shot because my eye was almost completely swollen shut. So I was put on antivirals. I was given a steroid shot. My doctor said, "Hey, these are the side effects of steroids." I said, "That's fine. Do what you got to do. I can't see out of this eye." Next thing you know, my period, like I had said, I had had irregular periods. Then I had my son, and they were completely regular, first time in my life. And I was not worried about it because I had just ovulated. I'm one of those people. I ovulate 14 days later, there's my period, like clockwork. And wasn't worried about it. Next thing you know, I am bleeding every single day for on and off. Like I would bleed for 14 days, get 2 days off, bleed again. So I bled pretty much on and off every single day for till September. So from July to September, I was bleeding like crazy.
Were you
Um,
so anemic?
I don't think, I mean, or if
Uh,
I was, I never got checked
yeah.
out.
I was like, oh gosh. I mean, that feels like a lot of blood
Yeah.
loss. Yeah.
Fight or flight with nursing school. It was, I love nursing school, but literally they said, say goodbye to your life, say goodbye to your family. You don't have time. So I didn't have time to, but I had lost 10 pounds. It was crazy. Next thing you know, I quit bleeding. I don't get a period anymore. I gained 15 pounds. And then it just, knowing like cervical mucus and fertility, it just wasn't there, or it was so scant. So something was off. And throughout this journey of being in nursing school, I'm trying to get a doctor to listen to me. I'm like, my hormones are off. All of a sudden, I have like this crazy, intense mood swings when after I ovulate. I'm having hot flashes. I'm not having cervical mucus. I'm not getting a period maybe every 80 days. And they're like, oh, it's nursing school. It's nursing school. And I'm like, okay, well, I ran a half marathon 2 years before I had my son, and during my miscarriage with the suicide and going to school, I still had a regular period. And all of a sudden, you're saying because of nursing school. And so that's when I decided to leave that one OB. And
That's being called
so
gaslit, peeps.
yes, and I had never. And what was crazy is when they did do blood work on me, everything was quote unquote normal, but it wasn't normal in my cycle. So I had just, so if that, I don't know if that makes much sense, but basically I had just ovulated, or I was ovulating that day, but my estrogen was in the level of someone who wasn't ovulating. My progesterone was, I can't remember where it was. Something else was at menopausal range. I mean, it was all over the place. But if you look at the pre-menopause, post-menopause, ovulatory, like that's how it was normal, because it
Yeah.
was normal in those ranges, but the overall picture, it was not. So,
Right. This is where I
anyways, the
say
whole,
go to functional medicine for a second
yes,
opinion, especially
yes,
functional medicine who specializes in hormones. I'm just bringing this up, Kelly, because I don't know what they have in Kansas, but here in Charlotte, North Carolina, we actually have this amazing group. I don't even know if I should say their name, but they're a bunch of OBGYNs that I actually used to work with in labor and delivery. And they stopped doing obstetrics. They went back to functional medicine school, and then they
yes, because they're like,
opened,
here's a pill, let me get on
right.
birth control. And I'm like, no, that's a band-aid.
Yes. So now they do both, right? Like they're gynecologists practicing, but
Mm-hmm.
they also have degrees in functional medicine and wellness. And their whole, like, everything they do is so cool, but it's all focused on hormones and balancing
Yes,
hormones from your thyroid to your glucose levels to inflammation. I mean, there's so many different causes. So, did they ever get to
yes,
the root of what was going on?
they never did. I am still convinced it had something to do with the steroid shot. Like, I have been told there's no way, but I'm like, is it though? Because this literally all happened from the steroid shot. Um, my my current OB does think maybe there was some kind of inflammatory response. He definitely did not. Granted, we haven't had this conversation in a long time, but I remember he was the first person that ever I felt like listened to what I had to say when it came to this is what happened. Anyways, that's kind of how we got pregnant again. Is we definitely had not been preventing for several months, but I also wasn't having much of a period either. And during that time, I had tried Vitex to help with my progesterone, and it did help a lot. And then I weaned off of that. I tried the keto diet, and that actually made things 1,000 times worse for me as someone who works out a lot. It just did not work out, excuse me, for me. Um, so yeah, 11 days post ovulation, number 11, I found out I was pregnant.
Wow.
And so, I'll never be, I was excited. I was like, wow, here we go. And this is going to work out so good because I'm graduating from nursing school here in a few months. Like, this is going to work out great. And, you know, around that time, I had just started finding out about my current OB, and this person being very pro patient autonomy and very pro natural. And again, that's what I wanted. And that's when the anxiety kicked in. I had had a miscarriage before, and it's just, I don't know, it's almost like a PTSD effect. Like, it just very panicky, almost felt like I just couldn't breathe. And just every little twinge, the more kids you have, you feel those cramps a little bit sooner as your uterus grows. And I was just constantly anxious and on edge. It doesn't help being in nursing school, but I was just constantly anxious. And those pregnancy lines were darkening just fine. But again, I was just freaking out. They did do blood work at my primary care and everything looked fine. And eventually I got in for an ultrasound at my OB's office. And I will say this, I don't know if the sonographer was new, if they were a student, if they saw something I didn't, but it was the most bizarre ultrasound I had ever had. So I go in, I get an ultrasound, and this girl's being very weird. She won't turn on the screen. She won't let me see anything. She won't even talk to me. Like I said, she may have been a student. And I'm freaking out. Like, here I am freaking out already. I'm maybe 7 weeks. And she's like not letting me see anything, hear anything. And she's like, says, I can't remember. She said something and left. And I was like, well, is everything okay? And she's like, yep, things are fine. I was like, well, was there a heartbeat? Like, what did you even see? And she was like, yep, there's a heartbeat. And she was so weird. And so, of course, I left that appointment freaking out because she wouldn't even turn it on the big screen. Like, I literally
that is
was just
really
sitting
weird.
inside. It was the weirdest ultrasound. Honestly, it was so crazy.
Kelly, I'm going to pause though.
Yeah.
If anybody finds themselves in a situation like this, like, as hard as it is, you got to leave. You got to walk out that door, go ask for the office manager, ask for an OB, ask for a different, you got to advocate for yourself. Like,
Yes.
These are the opportunities where you have to speak up and say, I am not leaving here without seeing my baby's heartbeat. And I want pictures, and I want the video screen on. And if that cannot be accommodated today, I'm going to come back tomorrow,
Yes.
But like, I mean, we can't go backwards, but I'm just trying to help. If someone else finds themselves in a weird situation, you guys get out of it. Reschedule.
Yes.
Reschedule.
100%. So, yes, no, I 100% agree. And, she finally gave me this picture, and it looked like this little, like, worm. And she said the heart rate was 100, which, of course, again, I'm anxious because she was acting so weird. And at the same time,
really
7 weeks with yes. And I was like, 7 weeks and it's only 100. And so, of course, I'm freaking out. I'm freaking out even more. I'm crying. I can't breathe. I'm having a panic attack. Something's just not right. I call my OB's office, and they called me the next day, and they're like, Dr. So-and-so did agree that it seems a little low. And so, of course, here I'm like, crying. And they said we could wait a few days and then he could perform the ultrasound for you. Because I told them what happened. I told them my experience. And they said, he will do it. So this is my first time ever meeting my OB, which I absolutely adore this person. I think so highly of him. He's just... he's getting busier and busier, and I know he's a great person, and I hope he listens to this podcast to understand like how respected he is, because he's a busy person. And side note, I feel like he's feeling the stress lately of being busy in healthcare, but he really is a good person. I just hope he understands that. Yeah. Anyways, first time ever meeting him, we do a bedside ultrasound, and heartbeat was like 143. So now it's tears of joy. I'm so happy. And he was just, again, first time truly meeting him, very nice guy. And he was like, we could do an ultrasound again in like a week, just to make sure things are going fine. And then the following week I would have an appointment with him. Okay. Well, I felt so good. I ended up canceling that ultrasound, which maybe it was a good thing. And then I go in to have an appointment with him. And this was right before we were going to announce it. So I should have been getting close to 11 weeks or right at 11 weeks. And he puts the Doppler on my belly. We can't get anything, which again, that's still early. Sometimes you can't Doppler that early. And he said, you know what, let's just go do an ultrasound. So I'm like, yay. And we are doing the ultrasound. I see the baby and I was like, wow, this baby's gotten so much bigger. I can actually see a baby this time. It doesn't look like a little bean. And I remember him like highlighting where the heartbeat should be and hitting the button and nothing. Dead silence. And so he very quickly gets out of that, highlights again, hits the thing, dead silence. And he sits back and he says, I am unable to find a heartbeat, which is very concerning. And I'm just like, boom, punched in the face. My world is just like, it's like he's talking to me and it's just, I'm in a tunnel at this point. And, you know, he's given me options of what do I want to do. You know, he said, I think we should try to get you in for a more in-depth ultrasound. You know, we don't have the capability of doing it here, but I can make some phone calls. And so at that point, he finally found a hospital that was like 25 minutes away. I don't know, maybe 45 minutes from closing. So I had to hurry. He's like, they can do an ultrasound tonight. And I was like, yes, let's do it tonight because I'm not going to be able to sleep. So here I am on the way to this other hospital. And he was so sweet. He was like, I will be there with you. You're not going to do this alone. I will be there with you. We will figure it out right then and there.
Wow.
And I was like, yeah, again, amazing dude. And I was like, okay. So here I am rushing to this hospital, which is all the way out west. And again, I've got to get there because they're going to close soon. And I'm calling my husband and I'm like, the doctor can't find a heartbeat and I need you here, but you're not going to be here on time. And, you know, just this panic in my voice. And so he's calling my parents. He's trying to get our son picked up. He's trying to rush all the way to West Wichita, which is just way farther from where we live, probably about 45, 50 minutes from our house. And we get there, they send me back. My mother-in-law actually met me there because I was alone, and the doctor comes in. They do an ultrasound, and I don't remember looking at the screen. In fact, I don't know if they put it up or if I looked away. I don't remember. And those sonographers shows me my baby, and it's a really good profile close-up of this baby. And she's said, but I can't find a heartbeat. And basically, given the measurements, baby had died like 4 or 5 days before my appointment. And so that was just absolutely heartbreaking. I was just crying my eyes out, and my husband finally got there. And what really resonated me with this doctor was he, like, my husband and I have our moment. He had stepped out, let us have our moment. And then he sat with us for like an hour and talked with us. And that was the first OB I had ever had that said birth control is a Band-Aid. It's not a cure. And he seemed like the first person who actually wanted to help figure out what my hormones were, who wanted to help me have a successful pregnancy. And so he actually introduced me to what's called NAPRO technology, which is where you use cervical mucus, progesterone, and things like that to help with finding out fertility. And long story short, into that, because it was what's considered a miscarriage. So the baby dies, but your body, you know, my first miscarriage, I started bleeding. I passed everything on my own. This one, my body still since I was pregnant. You know, that morning I was still having morning sickness. So we ended up opting for a cytotech induction, I guess you can say, which is basically it kind of forces your body into having this miscarriage, just because I was finishing up with nursing school. And for me, the trauma of not knowing when I was going to start bleeding and passing this baby was just, it was just building, it was just adding to the anxiety.
So your options, I'm hearing, were go home, and at some point your body will recognize that the baby is not growing anymore and you'll miscarry on your own. Second
Hopefully.
option, cytotech induction. Did they offer you a DNC?
Yes. And at that moment, I didn't, for whatever reason, I didn't want a DNC. And we went over, and we basically went over the risks and benefit of all three. You know, the risks of waiting for you to miscarry is it may not, and then you're at risk for getting very, very sick. The risk of side attack is bleeding and then the DNC. And for whatever reason, I didn't want the DNC. I don't know why. So after giving it a few days to think about it, I was really sad, but again, I just felt good to know I had a provider that actually seemed like they wanted to help me.
Yeah.
I did go ahead and opt for the side attack. And that was just a terrible day on its own, because just knowing, it's like I wanted to hold on to that pregnancy so bad. I like, me being in control of losing that pregnancy was just, it was a hard time. And I remember placing the side attack, and my husband stayed with me all day, and I just cried all day. And at one point he took me to lunch, and it was probably about 5 hours after placing the side attack is when I started bleeding.
Cramping too, or just bleeding?
No cramping, just bleeding. And that was at the restaurant. So of course I went to the car and started crying some more. So he took me home and held me. And it was maybe 15 minutes after getting home, I passed a baseball sized clot. And it just slowed down. And I thought, oh, maybe that was it. And
because baseball is very big.
So very big, not okay. And then later that evening, I was just having like a medium flow period with no pain. And I just remember thinking, wow, this was completely different. So at that moment, we go to my parents' house. I needed some extra support. We had told them we were pregnant, and so they were there for us. And it was when I was sitting down eating dinner with them, I start feeling contractions, and very mild contractions. And a little bit later, I just feel this weird urge down low. I just feel this urge to kind of push. And so I go to the bathroom and I push. And when I pull my panties down, there is, and it is a trigger warning, there is this baby. And I was not prepared for that. With my first miscarriage, it was just clotting and bleeding. With this one, it was actually very visibly a baby. There was eyes, there was hands, I saw this teeny tiny umbilical cord, and it was so traumatic. And I just cried and cried and cried. And I just held this baby. And I just was, again, not something I wanted to see. And then I was like, what do I do? I don't want to just bury this baby in a yard for us to move. And we ended up buying like a plant and like planting the baby in the plant. That way I had this plant forever, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But later that night, I did start I always tell my patients, if you start passing clots the size of a chicken egg or larger, soaking through more than 1 pad an hour, you need to get to the ER. Well, sure enough, that was happening to me. And in the back of my head, I knew something was wrong, but I was just so grief stricken and so in just a terrible moment that I just couldn't bring myself to do anything about it, as dangerous as that was. And I just wanted to sleep. I just wanted to close my eyes and basically not wake up. Like, that was just kind of, again, just so grief stricken. And thankfully I woke up the next day, the bleeding wasn't that bad. But then throughout every couple of days, I would start passing large clots and bleeding again. And by the time I'd go to call my OB, it would slow down. So then about a week later, I started having some breakthrough bleeding again and heavy clotting. And this is going to sound weird. For whatever reason, I just felt like I needed to check. Don't ask me why. I just felt like I needed to check my cervix because it was just weird. I was passing all these clots and there was something hanging out. And so I called my OB's office. They called me back. They said, that is not normal. Get to the ER. And that's when we found out I had retained placental fragments. And so it was causing me to continuously bleed. And at that point, we decided it was, and I was starting to get symptomatic at that time. I was feeling pale. My heart was racing. I definitely had lost quite a bit of blood throughout that week. And at that time, I was literally just passing these large clots, soaking the table in the ER. And God save that man. My OB on his day off came in on a Sunday and was like, what are your thoughts on what we should do? Would you like a DNC? And I was like, absolutely, let's do this. And So we did a DNC that completely stopped the bleeding. They got the placental fragments out. And after that, I just, that's when, again, major grieving process at this point, because now I'm several weeks away from graduating nursing school. I thought I was going to have a baby. I mean, there's just all these emotions. But on the horizon, that's when I was just getting ready to start as a labor delivery nurse. So,
well, that's horrible timing for pain and
yes.
grief and trauma and processing. Kelli, I am so appreciative that you have taken the last hour plus to share about being a labor and delivery nurse and about your son Reed and about your 2 miscarriages. And so we're going to move into part 2 because this episode requires the trigger warnings. And then part 2, Riley's, your rainbow baby.
Yes, and that was my healing birth. Like it truly was. Clayton's birth was great too, don't get me wrong, but from going through such trauma to her birth, it was so good.
Oh, I'm so excited. So everybody, please stay with us. Click on the next episode, which is part 2 with the birth stories of Kelli's rainbow babies. Okay, until then, we'll see you in a minute. Just keep listening. Go right to the next episode. Thank you for listening to Birth Story. My goal is you will walk away from each episode with a clear picture of how labor and delivery might go, and that you will feel empowered by the end of your pregnancy to speak up, plan and prepare for the birth you want, no matter what that looks like.